The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Welcome back to the Lighting Controls Podcast. We're your hosts, Ron Kuszmar and Webster Marsh. Today we're getting off the beaten path a little bit with Matthew Bein, and we're going to talk about cybersecurity. Not necessarily lighting controls specific, but hopefully we'll have some enlightening information to shed on our industry. Just wanted to let you know that this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA.
And this podcast is also financially supported by NAILD, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. And please do not forget that this podcast is currently being hosted on Get a Grip, but that is soon going to end at the end of the year, and you will only be able to find it on the lightingcontrolspodcast.com. So be sure to check us out there, follow us on all our social media, and don't forget to get yourself some sweet merch while you're there. And now, our conversation with Matthew.
All right, well, welcome everyone, and welcome Matt. Thank you so much for joining us here today. As I mentioned, you're kind of outside of our industry, but if you don't mind giving us a quick breakdown on who you are, what you do,
Sure.
before we get into the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Matthew Bein, I've been in the industry for probably, when you got to pause, it's a long time. So it's probably about 24 years now. I think I've been doing this in some capacity, always in cybersecurity. Really, I kind of cut my teeth in network engineering and actually electrical. I was all doing PLC panels and lighting, not lighting controls, but controls in general, which was kind of interesting. And then kind of morphed into all this whole cybersecurity thing that everybody's doing now, which is pretty wild. So it's a lot of companies that got, as we said, gobbled up by each other. Worked for Cisco in the past, Tenable, Mandiant. Now I work for Morphisec right now, which does some pretty wild stuff. And then on the side, I do things like this. If you can do podcasts here and there, or do higher education for kids and all kinds of things, and tell grandmas how to not click on bad things, it's a great day, right? So.
Well, thank you so much. I mean,
Yeah.
within our industry, we definitely are very insular with how much information we get from the cybersecurity world, and there's a lot of suggestions out there for how to beef up security, but at least from a standpoint of an expert or professional in your field, what is the best way to make sure that people don't click on the bad stuff, or that we keep our networks secure?
Yeah, I think a couple of things that people don't understand is that, no matter what protection you put on a system, it's always going to have a hole somewhere, right? Whether it's the software, the firmware that you have, the networks that you plug into, the laptops you bring in, because, lighting controls, somebody's bringing in a laptop somewhere, right, to do something. And that either was on some other network before, or they've got a USB stick that they want to run around with and plug into different ways. And those are essentially what we call the vectors of attack that start to happen on these networks that people either want to do malicious things or other motivations that they have, right? And how do you not click on things? It's really just, if you get an email that says, hey, your FedEx package didn't show up and you never ordered something that would come FedEx, don't click on it. It's really that simple, right? Right now, the biggest attacks or phishing campaigns that would essentially be out there would be things like around the holidays, right? Mm-hmm. And it's going to be like, for instance, you could do a spear-phishing attack on somebody because you knew that they bought candles from Yankee Candle. So you send them a 20% Yankee Candle coupon. Click here to redeem the code. And then you click on that code.
For our listeners' knowledge, spear-phishing attack, what specifically is that?
Sorry about that. Yeah, let's go to the little primer here. So a phishing campaign could be something that somebody crafts an email, and then they say, look, I'm going to send this out to a whole bunch of people in the world and see who clicks on it. And that's it. And see what they get. You're just phishing. That's all you're doing. Now, spear phishing is like if I wanted to send something that was very, very focused on you, Webster, right? So knowing that you were an EMT at one point, or you went to Bennington as a college, and then all these little things that I can figure out on social media, and then I craft a campaign just around that.
Right.
And I could say, hey, class reunion up in this location or something like that, and you click on it, and it's targeted at that one person. And it's a high likelihood that it'll work because it's something personal that we believe in, and it compels us to click on things. Now that click causes a piece of code to run in the background that would either exploit, meaning it would try to go after Chrome or Adobe or Word or Excel or something that you commonly use every day, and try to, as we call it, exploit that application, because they have what we call vulnerabilities. These are mistakes in code that we look for, and basically get access to your system, maybe to turn on the camera, maybe to turn on the microphone, take pictures, steal information. Could be, who knows, anything. A lot of times attackers and hackers and whatever you want to call them don't even know what kind of system they land on, because they're throwing it from God knows where in the country or in the world, and they start fishing around and see what they get. Right? They're on a system. They're like, whoa, I'm on Webster's system, but then all of a sudden they didn't realize they were on some hospital system that was exposed to the internet. Some have a conscience, right? So if they notice that, they wouldn't actually do anything.
So, for instance, some of the news headlines we've heard about where, big government companies have been basically taken over by this software. It's not that it was intentional that it was targeting that specific company. It's just that company had enough weaknesses that it managed to penetrate.
Yeah, the vast majority, that's the case. There are ones that absolutely particular cybercrime groups will target because of motivations that they have, right? You think of the Greenpeace piece of the world, right? Those types of things. Somebody has a campaign on Save the Whales, and then somebody doesn't like them, and they go after them or whatever, and it just causes a whole ruckus. Like the war in Ukraine, right? Same exact thing. There's bands of groups that are helping both sides in different ways. And it just depends on the motivation. What are you into, right? You're into lighting. Maybe we start a hacking campaign on lighting controls, because we want to turn the lights out at a concert.
Well, and so I mean, your role at Morphisec is kind of part of that prevention method, right? You're trying to create barriers between the people who want protection and the people who want to penetrate that protection.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's more of, we're definitely an add-on product that we have. So we add on to a Windows or a Linux system. And what they do is they actually, or Morphisec does, is they do cool things like randomized memory, moving target defense, they call it, in a couple ways, where you're moving things around and making it extremely difficult to attack a system. And if you keep moving a target, it's really hard to hit. And it's never going to be in the same place twice, right? So that's the concept. I think that's one of the things we need in this world, is that people feel that 80% is okay. But the problem is the education level across the board. Users, attackers, people that are cybersecurity analysts, everybody's getting smarter and they're learning. So what it causes is a more sophisticated attack to work, to successfully get into a network in that case, which causes in turn, right, a more sophisticated product to protect it in those cases. So it's crazy. But then you get into something very simplistic. I don't know if you guys heard this the other day. In North Carolina, everybody's worried about the power grid, right? Everybody's saying, the power grid, cybersecurity, everybody's going to hack and they're going to blow up a generator and all this stuff. They took out power for 4 days in North Carolina with rifles and a chain.
Right.
Right. And it's like, guys, forget about that, right? I mean, it's like these big things at a switch yard or at a substation. If somebody goes after a transformer there, that's not something we just swap out in 15 minutes. That takes like weeks. Right?
Yeah. So I mean, as much as we can beef up our cybersecurity, the actual security, the physical barriers between people and the devices is still critical. So I mean, depending on where you mount your hardware when it comes, using lighting controls as a situation, we have networked lighting control solutions where we have network switches. And if you mount those network switches in an easy to access location, well, you haven't prevented physical access to that.
Yep. It's a lot of things with lighting controls too. Some of the things I've been learning about it, because I come from a lot of the SCADA world, right? So like communicating over serial controls, RS-485, communicating over serial controls, Modbus, all these big types of controls that run like solar fields and stuff. And they do apply a little bit to lighting controls in some cases, but I think a lot has gone to IP-based networks, right? So things are smart now. And with them being smart, these little things that we have that make them smart have little things like web servers on them. And that web server is what I'd be looking to attack, because that's usually where the vulnerabilities exist. I think I did I don't know, I think I forget where I've got it here, but it's a remote control thing for turning a switch, a lighting circuit that I've got like in my garage. And Webster, you've seen the garage. Garage is huge. Yeah. It's got, I can put I'm actually putting 2 lights in each bay, very bright, but I don't want them all on. So the only way to do that on a single switch circuit is going to be to put some smart connectivity in there. But those little things are running a little Apache server on it that's just sitting out there on the internet. Now, if that's on the wrong network, somebody could actually exploit that and then be sifting around and use it as a pivot point to get around the network. The lighting control may not necessarily be the main target. It could be a side of that, and it could be used as a pivot point. So it's usually make sure your firmwares are up to date, make sure your switch software is up to date, make sure it's a segregated network. It's off on its own network. It's not on the general LAN that the users are using, and they're all connected to the internet and all of that. And these are all common basic practices that most of us should or do know in that case, but often forget because we get so caught up in the latest cool attack, like the coolest name like Babook, or something like a ransomware name, or these other ones like Mimikatz and all these crazy things. And it's like, guys, there's a little power switch that you can just turn off. Right? That's simple, right? I mean, it's
So I mean, from your standpoint though, it sounds like air gapping, where you actually physically keep networks separated, is the preferred method, to which is something that we hear a lot from IT groups when we're working with commercial buildings. Is no, you can't connect to our network, even if we do a VLAN or tunneling or some way of software barrier creation. It's best to just keep them completely separated.
Absolutely, yeah, or highly controlled. And usually, what I mean by highly controlled is that, and this is the thing too, is that if you're going to say air gapped, make sure it's air gapped, not somebody who goes, oh, I got this USB that I just had on the other network and I'm going to sneaker net it over to the other one, meaning I'm going to take a USB and walk it over and plug it in. That's still just as easy. It may not be able to get out, but it could definitely cause problems. So there's definitely methodologies and compliance measures that have to be put in place at that point for best practices, right? You have specific USBs that are only for that. You have specific laptops that are only in those areas, if it's truly going to be air gapped, or you highly control it. There's a firewall in between. The ports and protocols are highly restricted to what you're doing. Might be just Web 443, secure protocols or anything like that. Maybe some encrypted communication in those cases, so that it isn't something that I could just craft some packets on the network and then just inject it and then make that web server do something it shouldn't. Or maybe I don't care what it does. Maybe I just want to break it. And, the little tiny web servers don't take too many connections to make them fall over, to make them not respond. In those cases.
So I mean, this is something we were talking about with a previous guest with DDoS attacks. I mean, with a small web server, a DDoS attack is very effective.
Yeah, no, I've seen it in my own network. Actually, one of my own networks I was working on, it was a small, tiny time server. Nothing very big. It was probably a little thing, probably 5x5. Sat in a cabinet. We had a bunch of them around. Nobody could figure out why they kept going offline. And it was a major problem because our network was highly reliant on time. And they'd go offline and everybody's like, well, what's wrong? Well, what we forgot to do was, when some changes had occurred on the switches, we had everything on our DHCP scope, which is essentially just a way to assign IP addresses automatically. that were still all pointing at those old IP addresses that were now the time servers. So when something would say, give me an IP address, it would go boom on the time server, and the time server starts freaking out because everybody started to get to it. That was the problem. It literally was it. You know, use tools like Wireshark or like TCP dump to actually see what that device is really sending in the end, or what the traffic is that's sending it. It doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be. The internet is loaded with information.
And those tools you're talking about are software tools, so they're available for anybody to download.
Yep, they are. They're open source. They're easy. You don't have to buy them. There's a lot of documentation out there. There's samples out there you can read. And sometimes you kind of look at it. You may not necessarily know exactly what you're looking at, but you'll get clues into what you're thinking it should respond like, or things like that. It's very useful if you need it.
Yeah, I mean, there's trainings in our industry that will cover Wireshark, for instance, and how to use it with a networked lighting control system. But you know, I think from that standpoint, it's really integrators like Ron who work with that kind of software. Specifiers and architects aren't really going to break out their laptop and work on that. It's really the people who are skilled labor on the project that are going to be doing that. And so from a out of the box standpoint, you know, it sounds like that's not necessarily the best way to approach networked systems. And I know there's a lot of pressure coming from different government groups saying, hey, this needs to be what's known as pre-commissioned, where you just take it out of the box, put it in, and it's done. And it sounds like from a cybersecurity standpoint, that's not a good idea.
Not usually. There's a lot of questions that need to be asked at that point. You know, who's going to own it, right, is the big question. Is it truly an appliance? Because the definition, we always got in a fight at a place I was at all the time. And they'd be like, oh, we got this box we want to put on. It's got a name brand on it, cool logo. It's yellow, like the Google ones, the Google search appliances, when they come in, they're bright yellow. And you'd say, do I have root access to it? And the answer is yes or no. Now, if the answer is no, it's generally truly a true appliance, meaning the manufacturer has hardened the device to where you have to get a menu like select 1 to do this, select 2 to do this. And other ones will be like, it's an appliance, but you're like, I got root access. That means I can do things, right? Oh, no, you can't do anything. Well, if I have root access, that means I have a duty to not be negligent on how this device works, but to actually do compliance measures on it because I have root access. The responsibility shifts to the customer if they have root access. If they don't, it's on the manufacturer, right? And that's a very hard definition that's kind of come across. And it would get real messy because it would mess with policy too. It's who owns this device? That was the biggest question always. And it's like, the manufacturer got it. They said this would work. Okay, yeah, right.
Well, and so I guess, when it comes to what you're talking about, using more terms that our listeners may be familiar with, such as jailbreaking your phone, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about getting to the opened software of the actual nuts and bolts of that device and being able to tinker with how that device is going to function. It's not just going in and changing an app around or something. You're really taking ownership of the safety of that device and how it's going to operate within the ecosystem of your house or whatever it's connected to.
Exactly. And I think there's always been a very big stigma around, like, just to say for phones, for instance, and actually because a lot of lighting controls probably have apps that they use, right? So whether it be just a smart bulb simply, or the whole app controls something, whatever that is. Like, an article just came out, I think it was December 6th. It was Samsung S22 hacked twice in the first day of pawn to own up in Toronto. And I'm like, well, I guess it wasn't an iPhone, right? And there's always this big debate. Would people say, would you have an iPhone or would you have a Samsung? Case in point, right? It's hard because Android is doing such a good thing right now where they're making security updates way more frequent. They're working through security issues. They bring them to light. They're cutting down on things inside the Play Store. But Apple has always had this very controlled, methodical way of making it a real hard thing unless you jailbreak your phone and give attackers a way to do things. So it's a big no-no. I mean, if you connect up to corporate networks, a lot of times they'll check for that, and then you just can't use your phone on the network. But if you're looking to do more than the device will ask you to, and you need to put specialized code on it, that's usually a bad thing. Like looking for software keys on the internet to get free software, that usually comes with a payment in another form, like ransomware or other things that you're giving up that you're not sure of. It's quite interesting.
Well, and so, I mean, I guess you bring up a really interesting subject here, because in our industry, we do use API keys to be able to integrate touch screens from one manufacturer to another system, or do some kind of fancy thing. And so, Ron, I'm curious, how much time and deliberation is put behind the choice of the API key, and what kind of security systems do you work with to make sure that the network is clean?
Yeah, so it really depends on the manufacturer, right? One, and then also on the network we're on, right? So if we're on a municipal network, for instance, they are much more strict, and they have their rules that we must abide by for any sort of control system. A lot of schools have very similar rules, but a lot more sort of loose as far as control systems. And then some people just, their IT teams aren't as knowledgeable. And, I'd be willing to bet that leads to some potential risks and issues. A lot of times, unless we have to be on the same network, we do try to keep an isolated network, because as you know, in most instances, no one's going back and updating the network switches.
No.
Right? It may be years before firmware is updated on a lighting controller, because if it's not broke, we don't fix it. Right? So in a lot of cases, it is easier to keep it completely separated. So the lighting network cannot touch the outside world. So then the only potential risk is when the technician takes their laptop and connects to it, but then it can't get any further than the lighting network itself. So the risk is somewhat mitigated at that point, but that is those are big concerns.
Yeah, so I mean, taking this information that we're getting from Matt, I think, it's really eye-opening, at least from a lighting control standpoint, because, there is pressure from manufacturers to share network and to reduce the cost of the project, because of the fact that if you have two simultaneous networks with their own hardware, their own wires, that's an added expense to the project. And so, one solution that might be pitched is, okay, we'll go wireless then. That way you have less. But it sounds like, there might be ways of using wireless to still intrude on other networks. I know there are concerns that have been brought up where even if you have two unrelated wireless networks, you can still kind of use them to hack in. And I was curious what your thoughts are on that, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, wireless security's come a long way. I mean, there's still people using, like you said, old networks that are in play. If you're using things like WEP, which is an encryption algorithm that you use to secure your wireless. There's WPA and WPA2. Now WPA3 is out. Usually if you use the later and the most recent algorithms, if your access points support it in the device that you're connecting up to it, do it. Don't just let it sit out in WEP, because the ways to essentially break into that, I mean, fairly easy. I mean, somebody can sit out in a car sitting out in your front yard and then just try to hit the access point if it's, like, say, using WEP. And they're open source tools that they collect the information from after they excite that access point. And then it gives up information that then can be cracked to use the same WEP key as you. And then they're just out there on the network. That's it. So then there's other mechanisms that you can work with those customers or those manufacturers or anything to be in play, like using things like max security on top of it, or authentication in there, so that yes, you have to have the WEP key, but if you do associate with that network, you get prompted for authentication, or you use max security for that device, because these devices are generally pretty static. And then you have a list. One gets replaced, you change the MAC address. That's fine. It's all about making it harder for somebody to break in. Everybody is going to be able to find some type of way over time to get into it. But honestly, it's about time and value, and how hard is it going to be me to monetize on what I'm doing, right? If I put 60 deadbolts on the front of my door and I use a tank to come through the building, I got in, right? It's right. So,
But so I mean, we're talking about Wi-Fi in this example you're talking about. You know, we're not talking about Bluetooth or Zigbee or these other,
which is getting very big too now. Don't forget it. Bluetooth.
Well, sure, no, but
yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say low power Bluetooth is becoming a huge thing, especially at conferences and such. And then the access points now support that for tracking and doing all other kinds of things, charging over Wi-Fi. There's all kinds of cool tech. It does not have malicious intent, but there's ways to use it maliciously or break it or have a challenge, right? And there's fun times to do that, but you know, we don't want to be turning the lights off in a hospital. Right. So
right.
And so I mean, when we're looking at this from a holistic standpoint, I mean, the argument of, okay, yes, the overall initial cost of a project to go wireless is technically lower. If cybersecurity is a big concern of yours, you need to maintain that. You need to make sure the firmware is constantly up to date. You need to make sure that all of the security measures are implemented constantly. Whereas with a wired, completely air-gapped system, you don't necessarily need to update the switches over and over again, so long as it's not connected out to the world.
Right. Yeah. I mean, ask the questions with that too. I mean, if you're going to go onto a switched network, physical, like wired, you can ask for other things, like just say, hey, can you give me a VLAN? Right. And then the network administrators will know exactly what you're talking about. And then you get it locked down. Right. It's literally that easy. And then close it down so that it can get out to certain places, maybe the manufacturer of the lighting place, just for maybe there's some telemetry or something that's going back and forth for monitoring or whatever. There's ways to lock that down. It doesn't take much. And but what I found is that some places are sensitive about that. They'll say, well, if we're doing a separate VLAN, we go to a physical switch. Or if it's SCADA type things or control type devices, we want separate switching. And yeah, it adds to the expense because people are scared or not sure about the technology, or it's an education thing. You know, it depends on, and here's what's crazy. You're usually working with, like, even with what I'm doing to the companies I work for, every place you go to is a different dynamic in who understands what from an educational level, and then the political side of it is completely different. That you're dealing with so many different dynamics when you go in to try and ask for something. And you could see somebody go, well, we're not doing VLANs. And then the other guy goes, well, why? Well, because I just don't like doing VLANs. Okay.
I mean, it's the same situation in our industry too. I mean, you know, you could have somebody who's just vehemently opposed to wireless control solutions, and they can't explain it why, but they're just like, nope, I don't like it.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's and it's funny because I'll just go, you mean I couldn't just go over to that port that you have live in the conference room and plug in? Right. And then everybody forgot to turn it off because the last person needed a port when the laptop was in there. You know, whatever it is, you know, it's do your basics. You know, do your basics well. It's like EMTs, right? I mean, as EMTs, before you could do ALS, advanced life support, and get into the cool drugs and everything that you give people to keep them alive, you actually had to stop the bleeding before they died from bleeding, right? That was the best thing you can do is basic life support is the way you're going to keep somebody alive. It's the same thing with cybersecurity and IT and these devices that if you care and feed them, they're going to be good. I mean, things will not necessarily get broken into, and it'll be extremely hard. Not extremely hard, but much harder than it would be if somebody that just didn't take care of it. Right? It's
Right. So for our listeners at home too, right? So if we just even scale this back, because a lot of people now are putting more and more controls in their own house, whether it's lighting, they're like you said, they're putting things in the garage, whether it's for the garage door itself, or they're putting the Amazon lockbox thing on their front door so the delivery guy can drop packages. If you even just scale it back to that simple level, people need to remember to update the firmware and software of their own local devices as well, right? Their routers and stuff. That's probably one of the biggest attack points. So what you're telling me is I shouldn't be using my old Linksys WRT54G that's no longer supported.
Well, if you're going to go to the open source piece like DDWRT that's still base supported,
that's what I run on mine.
Yeah,
I do.
But if
I
they
run that
don't,
on mine.
If they don't have the firmware for it anymore because it went this thing called EOL called end of life, there's a reason they do that.
So it's important. It's important for people to not only keep their firmware up to date, but also know when products have gone end of life, so they can realize that, hey, I need to upgrade this device, right? I can't just keep using it until it dies, because at that point they've exposed whether it's their home or their office to all these potential risks. I'd have to imagine, we had another conversation with somebody else about even just printers, right? I mean, I'd have to imagine that's a big concern for a lot of people too, when people bring their personal printers into offices or schools and they don't do firmware updates, and those devices go end of life every 5 minutes. So
especially if they're networked. The biggest thing is actually we use those at times when we do assessments, just in the industry. I'm not saying this from where I work or anything, but just in the industry from where I've been, that was a vector of attack. So or a vector to find information, reconnaissance, those types of things. So you'd find a printer, maybe that had its settings still on there. Sometimes you can upload firmware. Sometimes you can use them as port scanners. These are things that scan the network to look for open communication on a computer or lighting control or whatever the heck it is. It's just to get the information back. It's not to do anything major. But then once you get that reconnaissance, you're going to know what your next step's going to be. And the idea is to make that harder. Lock down your printers. Make sure you update the firmware on them. Close them down. Put passwords on them. Sometimes you have fun times when you get on a network and you can just kind of HTTPS to this printer, and then you can see everything that's going on it. The worst case is when people do like scanning. If you scan a document, a lot of these things will actually hold a copy of that on the device. And if it does, and it's not locked down, and you can get to it, you could just steal a copy of that person's payroll slip, and now you got identity theft going on, right? It's right. Amazing. And a simple password would stop that,
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and so I mean, I guess one of the simplest situations that we can do for safety's sake is, if it's accessible to the network, give it a password.
Yeah.
If it's a touch screen, if it's a web app, whatever it is, give it even 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least something. Hopefully it's a little more secure than that. But
you really went the baseball route, didn't you? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
But so I mean, at least it's a buffer. It's something. Okay, yeah. If somebody keeps trying at it, they'll crack the password. But
yeah, exactly.
Like you said, you can put 1 million deadbolts on your door, but if somebody goes at it with a tank, same deal. You can have the most secure password. If somebody really wants to get into your network, that's a whole different story. But the most likely case, and we're almost out of time, so I'm going to kind of wrap this up a little bit.
Sure.
The most likely case that we have here is just a random attack. Somebody, basically somebody sent out a phishing scam of some kind, trying to just see what networks they can penetrate.
It's lobbing over the defenses that they have. Lob over it. That's what you're doing. Yeah.
And so, that's the most likely scenario with a lighting control system, is that it's just going to be one of those networks that if they are the weak link in the chain, they'll use that. But, unlikely that we're going to have these spear phishing attacks where it's a targeted attack, where we're really trying to, okay, yes, this is a lighting controls network I want to hack into. So, creating these basic buffers, these basic safety measures to make sure that, you have the latest firmware, the latest security measures, that the system's air gapped, or there's some kind of protection layer between you and the building's network, can really prevent these random attacks from getting access in to the rest of the system. Because I mean, lighting, yeah, okay, fine. If it's somebody's home and the lights turn on and off because they don't want them, okay, yeah, that sucks. But it's not critical infrastructure. Whereas in a hospital, that's more critical.
Right.
Or you have a tech firm that has lots of protected information that somebody can get into and steal. There's a lot of different variables when it comes to where that lighting is and what that network is controlling.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's best thing that comes to mind is like a bank, right? Somebody has lighting controls at a bank and they get access to it and they black it out because they're going to rob it or something. But in most cases, I would look at it as a pivot point. It would be something to be used as a tool for something else, not even for lighting, like turn the lights on and off. Right. It would be for finding something else.
Sure.
And then actually, if you do end up with people that want to put all the IoT type stuff, Internet of Things type devices on one network, see if they'll break it out, right? I mean, if you don't have to have your lighting controls on your HVAC control net or the SCADA net or whatever they're doing, it's a simple another VLAN that you can set up, or another network. In some cases, they're pretty easy to do. That would be just a nice little segmentation effort that you can do, right? And it's easy. It's not that hard. So,
but it's also not just the initial investment. There needs to be ongoing support for whatever network you have. You want to make sure that it's secure.
Yep. Exactly.
Well, Matt, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming in and talking.
Yeah.
You've had experience to a degree in our industry, but we're really kind of coming from different sides of the fence here, and I appreciate you just
definitely. I tell you, all my electrical buddies are calling me now. They're just like, I got this IT stuff. What do I do with it? And I'm like, oh, man, here we go. I said, look, wire it up and then call me. It's a crazy world. Thank you for having me, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, what a great conversation we had today with Matthew, and hopefully you've learned a little bit more about cybersecurity. But just wanted to let you guys know that this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association.
And of course, do not forget that it is financially sponsored by NAILD, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. And please do not forget to check us out on the lightingcontrolspodcast.com, as moving forward, this will no longer be hosted on the Get a Grip podcast forum. So please check us out on the lightingcontrolspodcast.com, and don't forget to check out some sweet merch while you're there as well.
And thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us here today. And thank you, everyone. See you next time.